Think forward. Think Research Channel.
There's a structural problem with genocide, which is that it tends to happen in places that are off the beaten path.
So now, in order to promote nonviolence and reduce violence, ultimately we have to address the motivation.
Society needs to acknowledge that learning is a lifelong challenge.
The sit-ins challenge cherished beliefs most whites held dearly.
At the DNA level, we're all 99.9% the same. All of us.
So individuals do matter. And I think the quality of our individual leadership matters.
Who is speaking for poor people? 40 million Americans make $6 an hour. Who is speaking for them?
The only thing that one has after throwing everything overboard is the love that one can give.
What we're going to be talking about today is called uxoricide, uxoricide, and that's the official term for when one parent kills the other. The study that we're doing is a qualitative study, which means that it's narrative. And what we do in qualitative research is we ask people to tell their stories. So what we're going to be doing today is telling you the stories that people have told us. The study that we are presenting on started in January of this year, and we have 41 people that we've talked to so far. The way we got started with this study is I was working with Dr. Jackie Campbell at Hopkins, and she was doing a study to look at the risk factors of homicide, or how can we help women predict when their abusive relationship is getting more dangerous and it might be leading to homicide. So for that study, we interviewed family members and relatives of women who had been killed by their intimate partner husband. Most often, the person that we were talking to was the woman's mother, and most often the woman's mother now had custody of the children. And as we were doing these interviews, the grandmother or the guardians of the children were saying, "What about the kids? What can you help us? We don't know. How should we be raising them?" And we looked in the literature and saw that there was absolutely nothing. There was one book, When Father Kills Mother, that was a series of case studies, but there was really no research at all on this topic. We decided that since these children are so vulnerable, before we should do any research with them, we should begin by talking to adults who had this experience as a child. So about 2 years ago, we decided to write a grant to NIH to see if we could study this. Well, we knew that in order to get funding from NIH, they were going to want to know two things. They were going to want to know, number one, would we be able to find these people? Would they talk to us? And number two, just how common is this? Because there really are no statistics on this at all. So what we did is we looked at the Campbell study, where she found that in 63% of the cases, the children were at home during the homicide, and almost half of them, the children witnessed the homicide. Then we took some Virginia Against Domestic Violence data that showed in 2001 there were 86 intimate partner homicides. 75% of those, the victims were in the childbearing or child raising years. We estimated at 2 children per family, there were 108 children in Virginia who had experienced an uxoricide, and then extrapolated that number nationally and came up with a number of 4,000. We wanted to compare it to something else, so we looked at childhood leukemia, and consistently, year after year, the numbers are about 2,600, 2,800 per year. And yet we all know how much research, funding, and interest there is in childhood leukemia, but no one was looking at uxoricide and the survivors of uxoricide. So this is our current study. Eventually we want to have 90 people. Right now we have 41. We're advertising, putting up signs, and very often we get referrals after we give a talk like this. So we are still openly talking to people. We interview people twice. It takes about an hour. Open-ended interviews. We just want people to tell us their stories. So as of this time, we've talked to 27 women and 14 men. You can see the ethnic breakdown. They're around 40, and we've got a pretty even break of their age at the time of the homicide. Okay, these are some of the themes that we are beginning to identify, and one of them is continued violence in the later life of many of the participants. Certainly not all of the participants, but many of the participants later in their life either were abused by a husband or boyfriend, or the men report that they were abusive. I have this very interesting subsample of men that we're going to be looking at eventually who really were very abusive. One man shot his later girlfriend, and after this abusive event, when they are arrested or in jail, they all of a sudden have like this epiphany where they say, I'm no better than my dad, and it literally turns their life around. And their lives now are just really very inspirational. They're mentors for young people. They're into their religion and their church. So it's really interesting how this altercation and this intersection with the criminal justice system really does make a positive difference for many of these men. For most of the families prior to the homicide, there was a lot of substance abuse, alcoholism. A lot of the current people report different problems with substance abuse. Okay, this is probably the major theme that we are finding that we are kind of probably the most surprised about. And in retrospect, we probably shouldn't be surprised, but what we have found is these adults make peace with the assailant. That eventually they somehow, after the assailant gets out of jail, usually, they decide that they have to reestablish a relationship with this person who killed their mother. And we are interviewing both, but right now we've had mostly dad killed mom. And there's a couple of different themes or reasons for why their relationship is reestablished. And everything I'm saying now are all direct quotes from what the people have said. A very common theme is, well, we all make mistakes and I forgive him. He was in a blackout is not unusual. He didn't know what he was doing. Then there's another whole theme or another whole reason for why people believe it's important to reestablish with the perpetrator, and that's usually a religious reason, and it's something along the lines of, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. It's not my place to judge what he did. This is a direct quote. One woman said, no matter how sick this family tree is, I'm still a branch on it, and I better know about this family, and I can't just escape or cut the family off. This quote, he is the only grandparent my children would have. This is also a very common thing. He is very often the only grandparent, and they don't want to deprive their children of having a relationship with a grandparent. This is another common theme, and this is a direct quote. She loved that man. She would have wanted us to take care of him. These were two sisters that we interviewed. Actually, this was in the pilot. And mother was very religious. Dad shot mom in front of them. And as mom fell down, mom fell in a chair and asked the girls to bring her Bible. And then she said to the girls, don't hate your dad. He can't help it. He's sick. And then died. And those children are now taking care of dad. So for many people, especially women, they see this as a way to be loyal to the memory of their mother. This was an interesting quote. This was a woman who was 14 when her mom had left dad, and she and her 12-year-old sister and mom had left to live with grandparents, but he still kept coming around and harassing them for about a year. And then finally he called and he said he wanted to meet them at McDonald's, so mom went alone. When mom pulled up to McDonald's, he got a gun and just shot her. And the next day, the woman remembers reading in the newspaper that her mother was killed by her estranged husband, and that is a term that you see a lot. And the woman says she can remember turning to her sister and saying, "Look, everybody knew he was strange, and nobody stopped him." One of the other big things that we have found is people tell us that being in the study is the most they have ever been allowed to talk about it. And this is probably one of the themes that is really coming through loud and clear that we can now say to family members who are raising these children of uxoricide, let them talk about it. What happens often is if the children witnessed it, they are told not to talk about it before the trial. But then after the trial, nobody ever says, "Oh, you can talk about it now." So what the people report is, and don't forget, most of these people, it was maybe 20 years ago since the homicide, so things might have changed since then. But most often people say, the people that adopted me said, you need to put the past behind you, forget it, move on. We're not going to talk about that. That was something bad, and it's important for you to just get your life together and move ahead. And they wanted to talk about it. They needed to talk about it. This is something else that we started seeing in the pilot and is becoming really very clear. The kids that make it usually have one person who was important to them and who was consistent for them. Because very often these kids end up in foster care, and they can go from one foster care situation to another. We talked to a brother and sister, and they had an aunt who was this important person to them. And she wasn't even around that much. She was a missionary, and she came right after the homicide. That was the case where Mom shot Dad. She was put into the psychiatric hospital. She was there for about 9 months, and so the aunt came and took care of the brothers and sisters. But then she went back to be a missionary, and the children all said that after that, Mom was in no position to take care of anyone. She was a burnt-out shell, so the kids really raised themselves. In fact, the one woman said that when she was 14, she ran away from home, and she was gone for a week, and her mother didn't even know that she had run away from home. So the mom really was not there, but this aunt was there for them at a distance. She went back to the mission field, but she would send them letters, she would send them tapes, and just knowing that she was there for them, even though she was on the other side of the world, really made a difference. Another theme that's kind of coming out that's interesting, a lot of people say that people don't know what to call the assailant. And so they don't want to call him your dad because they think it's going to somehow insult this child. So they start calling the assailant who killed the mom by his first name. And that was very troublesome to many of the people. They wanted people to continue to call him your dad and not by his first name. We have found that very often children do indeed find the body, and many of them try to clean up the mom or try to clean up the room. This is probably some of the most painful memories, but that is consistently what, if the children are around, they try to do something to take care of the mom. And now Rick is going to give a case study of one of the families.
Wanda was the first member of the family we talked to. Now, she was 3 years old when her father, who worked in the mines, killed her mother. They had been estranged, that great word again, and he had finally moved out of the house. Her father came back with the intent of killing himself in her presence. At least that's what Wanda reported he said later. But when he arrived, he decided to kill his wife instead. Because she was only 3, Wanda does not remember anything about the event. There were 5 children in the family, a boy, Michael, who was born when his mother was 16 to a different father, a girl and another boy, then 2 more girls. When she was grown, she heard rumors, that is Wanda did, from distant relatives that the paternity of some of the other siblings was in question. Her father was a heavy drinker, her mother had affairs, and that's how Wanda understood their marriage to work. But she also reminded me that the information, all her information, came from her father's side of the family. Following the homicide, the family was split up. The oldest boy was adopted outside the family. The two next oldest lived with their father's brother and his wife. And the two youngest, including Wanda, were adopted by her mother's sister and her husband, a maternal aunt. No one in the family was ready to take all 5 children. The rules in Wanda's family included a prohibition against talking about the homicide, a complete prohibition. In fact, Wanda did not know she even had siblings, besides, of course, Ruby, who lived with her, until she was older and her other siblings contacted her. Now, in the aunt's family, there were already 2 girls, and they were slightly older than Wanda and her sister. Wanda says they treated her well enough until she reached puberty. Then her uncle, her now adoptive father, who was a captain in the Navy, high rank, began to sexually molest her. Wanda says he molested her sister and his own 2 daughters as well for years. Wanda finally told her aunt about it, and she immediately threw her husband out of the house. She believes that her aunt could not have not known something was going on. But when finally she was confronted with it, she did act. She threw him out, but she also threw the 2 young girls out of the house as well. Wanda went to a girls' home run by nuns and stayed there until she was an adult. After she became an adult, she had a couple of marriages that didn't last very long and refused ever to have children. And now she lives in a farm that's filled with rescued animals, and she works in social services. So she said, "Would you like to talk to Bob?" And I said, "Great." Now, Bob's the middle son. He was 7 when the murder took place. He doesn't remember it either. He and his sister went to live at their father's brother, a paternal uncle. Now, he says there was much love in this uncle's and aunt's house, but he also was not allowed to talk about what happened. He knew he had 2 younger sisters, but he did not know what had happened to them, where they went. He was able to meet with his older brother only once. When his father was released from jail, according to Bob, Dad was convicted of manslaughter and served 7 years. According to Wanda, he served 11. There's a lot of places where their stories begin to diverge, and you'll see that. His uncle would not allow him to see his father when his father came to visit. Now, Bob was continually in fights in high school and used drugs off and on. He didn't have a happy childhood. After school, he went into the army and was eventually stationed overseas, but he couldn't stop fighting, and he couldn't stop using drugs, and eventually he was discharged for defying authority. He eventually developed a relationship with his father, and when his father grew sick, his father actually came to live with Bob for a while. Bob doesn't speak to 2 of his sisters and doesn't have a close relationship with any of the other siblings. He says he's not been treated well by them over the years, and recently his next younger sister has been saying terrible things about him. Bob drives a truck on a local run, and he lives alone after a divorce, except recently his 28-year-old daughter, who had a failed marriage herself, has moved back in with him. Now, Wanda said, "Would you like to talk with Ruby?" So I got to talk with Ruby. She's the next oldest sister that Wanda was raised with. Wanda explained, though, you have to talk to Ruby not real early in the morning because she sleeps in, and not afternoon because by 1 o'clock in the afternoon she's too drunk to carry on a conversation. So you have to catch her in that small window. And that was true, because I tried at other points and it didn't work out very well. Ruby says she remembers the killing very well. She was 5 when it happened, and she has these vivid memories. She came into the living room, and her father was already there, and her father was wrestling with her mother. She jumped on his back and tried to pull him off. Her father pushed her away, then shot her mother. Ruby tried to clean up her mother with paper towels until the police arrived. She says this was very traumatic, but also equally traumatic was later on, years later, lying in bed and hearing her uncle, the captain, come up the stairs to molest her sister. According to Ruby, only Wanda was molested. Ruby says she managed to keep him away from herself, and he never touched his own children. When Wanda was sent off to the girls' school, Ruby was sent to the reformatory in the state capitol. There was no real crime involved. The aunt, the adoptive mother, simply said she's incorrigible, and back then that was enough to get you locked up. After she turned 18, she started living with a group of friends in an apartment that none of them could really afford. So she and her friends started having rent parties. Now, during the rent parties, they would invite people over and sell them drugs, and Ruby would dance. So pretty soon, Ruby was dancing in topless bars to make a living. She became a heavy cocaine user and an alcoholic. She says she has hepatitis now, and her liver is failing, and she hasn't been able to work for some time. But she's married to a very kind man who has a good-paying job, and they live together in a nice suburban middle-class home. And she says the last time she saw her brother Bob, he came over to the house during the daytime and made a pass at her. So that's what Bob was talking about, I guess. Wanda was also my contact for the two older siblings. Michael was the first one of those I talked to. He was 12 when it took place, and his story of the homicide is completely different than Ruby's. He was sitting up late with his mother one night. He's his mother's favorite, born to a different father. His father had moved out of the house, but he still had a key. He let himself in, and he said something like, "I'm going to take care of you and your mother," he said while waving this gun around. Michael realized later that what he actually meant was, I'm going to shoot my wife and her mother-in-law. But Michael thought he meant him, so Michael hid behind the couch. And when the shooting started, he ran out the back door. He says he's always felt really guilty that he didn't stay with his mother and protect her, even though he's only 12. When the shooting stopped, he went back in the back door, went upstairs where all the kids were still in bed, got them, and led them all outside. From his account, Ruby was never in the room, never wrestled with his father, and was not there to clean anything up. I don't know the truth. Michael sent me to Martha, who was 9. And she was adopted by the uncle and lived with Bob. She doesn't remember much about the murder because she was sleeping when it happened. So she can't clear out who was telling what, or who had an accurate picture or not. She didn't fare well with this uncle that Bob said where there was much love. The couple already had children, and Martha was treated like hired help, she said. She had little money, and she was not told that her adoptive parents were receiving a check each month from Social Security to support the two of them. This is a theme that runs often, that this money makes a difference, and sometimes the kids don't know about it. Well, I'm going to stop, because Barbara's talked about lots of themes, and you can see them running through these things, and I want to make sure that I don't say the last word here.
I'm here this morning to share with you my story. The phrase domestic violence has impacted my life from the very early stages of elementary school. Unbelievably, I never really grasped the meaning or even gave it a second thought until the early morning of December the 30th, 1980. Not just another woman's life had ended, but my mother's. I'm here this morning not as a victim, but as a human being. And I say that to say that domestic violence does somehow impact you and everyone around you. Therefore, domestic violence is everyone's business and should be discussed openly and regularly. My story started, hopefully it started as a wonderful courtship, which led to me, ready or not. And then holy matrimony, ready or not. Life was really great some days and not so great on others. The police would come and things would be quiet for a couple of days, even weeks sometimes. As I grew older, it was hard for me to understand why my stomach was nervous in the early morning when I heard the key in the door, or when I was awakened to a fight in the middle of the night. This was easy to write, but I guess to say out loud. The next morning, everything was supposed to be okay. They went to work, and I went off to school. It was hard trying to stay awake, let alone concentrate, because of last night's events. My problems at home were not to be discussed at school, even though my teachers had begun to wonder. Now, Grandma's house was safe, and there would be no acting up there. Our secret was never discussed openly for years until it ended. They never knew how these events would affect us or the scars they would leave us with forever. My first day back to school was the toughest day of my life. That's because I was looking at my friends and teachers who had no idea what to say to us. Here I am now, much later in life, the mother of 3 and a proud grandmother. My granddaughter so often will ask me, "Granny, where is your mother?" I'll reply with the same question, "Where is my mother?" She replies, "She's up with Jesus." Then she'll ask, "Granny, where is your daddy?" And I'll ask her the same question, "Where is my daddy?" And she replies, "Up with your mama and Jesus in heaven." And I respond, "Yes, he is." And to those of you listening, I guess it seems that the beginning of my life wasn't so great. Those events prepared me and gave me experience in the area of deep secrecy, which left me with the edge in the world of relationships. I knew what was right and what was wrong. These events paved the way for my children to grow up in a violence-free family, a violence-free home. And I can say all of the events from the past have made me who I am today.